over 2 weeks ago, I turned my computer on after Shabbat and noticed all these multicolored lines on the right side of my screen. Upon inspection, it became clear that somehow I'd cracked the corner of my laptop screen and would need to have it repaired. Obviously, the timing was not great vis-a-vis this holiday and the one next week you might have heard of, but the process was pretty painless. I made an appointment, brought it to the store, and got it back 5 days later, good as new. For those 5 days, though, I needed to be able to access my temple and school emails on my phone, since I would have no computer. Usually, only my personal email goes to my phone, so that I don't check my work or school emails from my bed or a restaurant or the subway. They can wait for a moment when I'm tuned in to temple and school. And it's not like the boundary is so wide. I live in New York City, so at their closest point, my bed and my desk are about 3.5 feet apart. I routinely sit at my desk and check my email right before I go to bed and right when I first wake up, but at least not in my bed. So, we've established that it is important to me not to check my email the moment after my eyes open in the morning or right before they close at night. So, in those 5 days I had to have my temple and school emails on my phone. How many times do you think I checked them from my bed? I lost count. At least 10. I even checked my work email at a camp reunion with friends I see at best twice a year in the woods with terrible cell service at midnight on a Saturday. What, might I ask, did I think I was going to find there? What I guess I did find there is something I already knew, and I think we all already know, which is that it's really hard to put things down, to truly set them aside when they're at our fingertips. This morning, our teens read beautifully about the creation of the world, specifically God's creation of boundaries. The boundaries between day and night, between earth and sky, between birds and fish, and in a final culminating act of creation, between work and rest. The heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array. And God completed on the seventh day the task that God had done. And God blessed the seventh day and set it apart, for on it God had ceased from the whole task that God had created to do. The word for task or work here is melacha. Melacha is not the deep, meaningful work that might fulfill us. That's avodah. Rather, melachot are the abundant small tasks that fill our days. Even though I imagine creation as a tremendously meaningful endeavor, God still needs rest from the mundane tasks it involves: speech, creation, separation. Even those of us who love what we do, who find fulfillment in it, get overwhelmed with the melachot, with the tasks of our lives. The headlines about burnout are all around us. A Gallup poll that stress among workers is at an all-time high. An article about how information overload from after-hours email is detrimental to employee health and productivity. The emergence of a phenomenon some are calling quiet quitting, where employees only do the work in their job description and stop checking email right at 5 p.m. So many of us are so tired, and so many of us don't know how to rest. But that's not a personal or generational failing. Rest is hard. As long ago as 1951, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote that labor is a craft, but perfect rest is an art. We spend so much of our days perfecting the crafts that make up our labor, our work, as much as it may enrich and invigorate us or bore and drain us. And I don't just mean the labor, the work we do in jobs. I also mean learning in school or for personal growth. I mean parenting and household responsibilities. I mean volunteering, healing, caring for others, and more. We work hard to perfect the crafts of our daily labors. But when God created the world, God created boundaries and gave us the great gift of rest, the seventh day. And God didn't just create it for rest. The Torah says, Vayikadesh oto. God sanctified it, or perhaps more literally, set it apart. Our rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud famously devoted a lot of time and intellectual energy to figuring out how we should rest on the seventh day. They outlined 39 melachot, 39 types of tasks that we should rest from on the seventh day so that we, like God, rest from melacha on Shabbat. But they went even further. In order to set Shabbat apart, they outlined what needed to be set aside. Our rabbis created a category called muktzah, literally set aside. Muktzeh in a good modern Hebrew accent, but all my teachers say muktzah in Ashkenazi pronunciation, so I will too. To understand muktzah, we first need to start thinking about objects in terms of their primary purpose. Some are easy. A pen's primary purpose is writing, a fork's primary purpose is helping us eat, a TV remote's primary purpose is operating the TV. The word I'm translating as primary purpose is actually melacha. An object's primary purpose is its task. Something is muktzah if its primary purpose, its melacha, is traditionally forbidden on Shabbat. So, for example, the rabbis of the Talmud would consider a pen to be muktzah because writing is a melacha they abstain from on Shabbat. And if an object is muktzah, they don't touch it or move it on Shabbat. Now, it's possible I can hear what you're thinking. Why is the rabbinic intern talking to us about traditional halacha, the Jewish law and practice we associate primarily with Orthodox Jews? She knows this is a Reform synagogue, right? I do. And I'm talking about it because I think it has something to offer us in its wisdom about how hard it is to rest. And to be completely honest, I used to think muktzah was totally silly. I personally don't write on Shabbat, but when I was first learning tractate Shabbat in the Talmud, I thought the notion that merely holding a pen might entice me to write was absurd. Then again, I also thought I was capable of not checking my email in my bed. So let's take muktzah on its own terms for a few moments. Consider the pen. With it out of my hands, I'm free to read and dream and think and just exist. But with it in my hands, suddenly I can add mustard to the grocery list when I noticed I finished it, pull out my planner and write in a few things I've thought of that I need to do in the coming days, and maybe make a few notes in my sermon notebook about what I might say on Rosh Hashanah. I'm not saying that any of these things are bad. None of them are remotely morally reprehensible. But they really start to add up to a day that is full of completing tasks. So the question I'd encourage us all to ask ourselves is, what can we put down, literally or metaphorically, to allow ourselves a better taste of true rest on the seventh day, on Shabbat? We say that Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world, so let us acknowledge the birth of boundaries by rededicating ourselves to setting, let's start with one of our own. And I'm not convinced traditional categories of muktzah are the way to go. Sure, I don't really carry pens around on Shabbat, but the most important thing for me to set aside is technically permissible on Shabbat. I don't do schoolwork on Shabbat, at all. When my Orthodox friends in college would print out their class readings to do without a computer, I would roll my eyes and read a novel, politely. It at times seemed intensely silly at moments as a rabbinical student. I won't even read sections of Torah assigned for homework on Shabbat. But it's been the most important and most meaningful way to set Shabbat apart. I've needed to set something aside, the very something that has been both my primary stressor and my most beloved endeavor for my entire life. And as I contemplate life after finishing, or at least pausing, my formal education when, God willing, I'm ordained in May, I too am contemplating what to set aside. It won't be class readings anymore. So let's take some time in the days to come to think about what it might be, what we can set aside to get a better taste for, as Rabbi Baisley calls it, the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. If all this sounds mightily inconvenient, I think that's okay. I think it's maybe even good. It might be inconvenient by design. Shabbat reminds us that we are more than our work, that our time is not valuable only in its productive potential. Indeed, I've been framing Shabbat as rest in a reality when most of us are tired or more than tired, but Heschel reminds us that Shabbat is not just about rejuvenation for the other 6 days. He writes that the Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekdays are for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but the climax of living. I often wonder if Heschel's optimism about Shabbat, which he also calls an island of stillness in the tempestuous ocean of time and toil, was largely possible because he was employed by a Jewish institution and lived in a time when married men did very little domestic labor or child rearing. But I think it is possible to get a taste of what he's talking about, even within the limitations of our lives. We can set something aside to set Shabbat apart because it's hard to set Shabbat apart if we don't. It might be grocery shopping or organizing the important pieces of mail that have piled up, or extracurricular activities that cut into time with family and friends. For my mom, it's the gardening tasks specifically that she doesn't like and answering emails. For those of us who take care of others, setting our tasks aside entirely is often much less than possible. But we can find something that can be left until Sunday so that we can enter a harbor for respite from that tempestuous ocean of time and toil. And though Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the boundaries, we all know that boundaries can be blurry. When does night begin and day end? Is a beach, sea, or land? Sometimes blurring tasks and rest is okay. Let's return to Muktzah, shall we? The Talmud outlines a very complicated disagreement between two sages named Rava and Rabbah about when you actually can use something whose primary purpose is forbidden on Shabbat. I won't get into the details because we'd be here for another hour and I'd need a whiteboard. But suffice to say that Rava and Rabbah agree that one can use something whose primary purpose is forbidden on Shabbat for a permitted purpose. So, for example, if I had nothing around to stir my tea, I could use a pen to do so. Rava also holds that one can move things whose primary purpose is forbidden when one needs the space the object takes up. So, if I leave my pen on the table and I want to host friends for a meal around that table, I can move the pen. While Rabbah disagrees, the classical scholars of Judaism hold like Rava. So according to traditional halakha, one can move things to make space for other things. Again, why do I share this? Because while I want to encourage us all to think about what we can put down, what we can set aside to bring more rest and more joy to Shabbat, I don't want to encourage too much rigidity. Sometimes boundaries need to be porous. But when we do pick up what we intended to set aside, we should know why. Is it to serve the permitted purpose, shall we say, of rest and joy? Or is it because we can't get out of the habit of constant productivity? As this new year begins, let's try to break that habit, to cast off the yoke that is always trying to get something done, Let us sanctify Shabbat by setting it apart and set aside what we must set aside to make it holy, to make it special, to make it a respite, to make it, as Heschel calls it, an armistice in the cruel struggle for existence. Let us keep a hold on Shabbat by putting down our tasks, and in doing so, allow Shabbat to keep us. Shana Tova.